Let's get some practice writing conclusions here. In all of these problems, I actually give you the p-value, so we don't have to do those calculations. We'll do more practice of that in the video after this one. But let's just get practice like, okay, you say reject the null. What does that mean in the context of these problems? So let's go back and do a quick refresher of what our hypotheses were. In words, again, we did some math, but in words, our null hypothesis was that we're meeting emission standards, right? We did that in, I think, 8b. And what we were trying to test was that we were not meeting emission standards. But the null hypothesis is really all we need for our conclusion. So we have two options, right? We'll either reject or fail to reject. We'll either say there is enough evidence to suggest that we are not meeting emission standards, or we'll say there's not enough evidence to suggest that we're failing emission standards. We're never proving that we're meeting emission standards. We're only saying there's enough evidence that we're not, or there's not enough evidence that we're not. There's a lot of double negatives in hypothesis testing, which makes it even more confusing. So we found that the p-value was this small guy over here. So p-value 0.0009. Is that less than 5%? Yep. The p-value is small. It is very unlikely that we could be meeting emission standards and get so few of our cars passing the test. Or it's possible that we have 90% success and that none of them pass the test. You just have to get the 10% 56 times, which would be very rare but possible. But that's what we're doing here. We're saying, okay, it doesn't matter necessarily how many actually met emission standards. We're just trying to test whether there's enough evidence, given the sample size, to suggest that, yeah, we probably really are failing or not. So here we're going to say reject the null. But what does that mean? Our sentences are either going to look like one of these two, pretty much for most of these. Either there is enough evidence or there's not enough evidence. So we're rejecting the null, so we're going to choose this one. There is enough evidence to suggest the assumption is not true. That's what we're going to say here. What is this pop-up thing? I got no clue. There is enough evidence to suggest that the null isn't true. The null is that we're meeting emission standards. So we're saying that's not true. There's enough evidence to suggest we're not. Let's not say us. The companies not meeting emission standards. That's the conclusion. Do another one. I'm not going to box the answer. That's silly. The official poverty rate was 14.8% in the US. A city official wants to test if their country was a different poverty rate. So remember when we found our null hypothesis, in words, the null hypothesis was that this city poverty rate is about the same as the national average. Right? That was what our null hypothesis basically said. We were trying to test whether it was different. So is our city basically the same, or is it like statistically significantly different? Well, we found our p-value is 0.273 according to their calculations. Well, is that smaller than alpha? If so, we reject the null. No, this is bigger than 5%. So now we have a big probability, relatively speaking. This is not a small probability. This could have happened. Yeah, sure. That's what p-values are all about. How likely would this have been to happen? And we're saying this is a believable probability. A 27% chance, yeah, that's pretty typical. Not super often, but it's typical enough. That's what the significance level of 5% means. If it's above 5%, we're going to say it's normal enough. If it's below 5%, we're going to say that's pretty small. We're getting concerned. Nothing special about 5%. It's a line in the sand. There's no hard and fast breaking point where it goes from one to the other. But this is bigger, so we fail to reject the null. What does that sentence look like? There is not enough evidence to suggest the assumption is incorrect. That's how we'll phrase our conclusion. There is not enough evidence to suggest that our assumption is wrong. So we got a lot of negatives. So let's just write this placeholder. We'll erase this. So what does it mean for our assumption to be wrong? This is what we need to replace. But we got some English double negatives going on here, or triple negatives. I don't know. There's a lot of negatives around. So the assumption is that the city's poverty rate is about the same. So there's not enough evidence to say that that is wrong. There's not enough evidence to say the city's poverty rate is different. Okay. Again, that's the big jump. That's the hard part. What does rejecting the null mean? What does failing to reject the null mean? That's the trick here. Failing to reject the null means that it's not the same as accepting the null. Failing to reject is not the same as accepting, but it's kind of similar. So that's why we are suspecting the city's poverty rate's pretty close to the average. So there's not enough evidence to suggest that we're different from the average is the real right way of translating that. Let's do one more. So drugs that prevent seizures sometimes have unwanted side effects. A researcher wants to study a drug. Okay, we haven't done this one. So we really do need the null hypothesis here and the alternative hypothesis. A researcher wants to study such a drug and look for evidence that such side effects exist. Runs a test and finds a p-value. We might be missing information on this one, actually. So what is she trying to test? She's trying to test to see whether there's evidence of significant side effects. That'll be our alternative hypothesis. There is evidence of statistically significant side effects. So if that's the alternative, what's the null? There aren't statistically significant side effects. Not significant. And let's not write evidence since we're using evidence in a couple different ways. Let's just say there is or is not. Side effects. I didn't spell effects anywhere close to right. It's been a rough day for me, I guess. All right. We're looking for evidence that there are statistically significant side effects. Our p-value is 0.06. Well, that's bigger than alpha. We fail to reject. Since we fail to reject, we'll phrase our sentence the same way we did the last one. There's not enough evidence to suggest that this is false. So there's not enough evidence to suggest, sorry, this is our triple negative situation, which is why I was losing my mind. Okay, so there's not enough evidence to suggest the assumption is false. What does the assumption being false look like? The assumption is that there's not side effects. That being false means there are side effects. So that's our answer. That there are significant side effects. Okay. Failing to reject the null is like accepting the alternative. Does this read similar to accepting the alternative? Sorry, failing to reject the null. Rejecting the null is like accepting the alternative. Not exactly the same, but it's close. Failing to reject the null is similar to accepting the null. So there's not enough evidence to suggest there are significant side effects. We're not saying there are no side effects. We just say there's not enough evidence to say that there are side effects. Again, it's kind of a small distinction, but there is a distinction here. Okay? And this is our answer. Not enough evidence to reject the null. The null is that there aren't side effects. Rejecting it is that there is side effects. So that's what we put here. There are side effects. And then we're saying there's not enough evidence for that. That's kind of the logic. That's kind of the step-by-step process. And again, if you kind of look at each one of these that we've done, we can kind of interpret it in that way. There's not enough evidence to reject the null. This right here is rejecting the null. The null is that the poverty rate is about the same. Rejecting it says it's different. What I have underlined in red is that saying it's different. Up here, there is enough evidence to reject the null. Underlining this red stuff is what rejecting the null looks like. The null is that we're meeting emission standards. Rejecting the null means we're not meeting emission standards. It's kind of a fill in the blank with rejecting the null, and that's the confusing part. Let me know if you have more questions about this. We have more practice coming up for you. Full videos of hypothesis testing. So don't go anywhere. Well, no, you can go somewhere. You can take a break and then watch the next one.